What if I told you that the most powerful country on earth isn't trying to avoid collapse, but is actually rushing straight into it? Not by accident, not out of incompetence, but by design. Because right now, while you're watching this, fuel prices are rising, global tensions are escalating, and behind the scenes, the United States may be preparing for something far bigger than war, something irreversible. And here's the part that should scare you: if this theory is true, then everything you think is chaos is actually strategy. Just hours ago, world leaders began preparing their populations. Australia, the United Kingdom. They didn't say everything is fine. They said, expect pain, expect higher costs, prepare. That's not reassurance, that's conditioning. And then came the message from the United States. No talk of sacrifice, no talk of struggle. Instead, confidence, aggression, dominance. We will hit them extremely hard. We will complete our objectives very shortly. We will bring them back to the Stone Ages. Now stop. Think about that. Because historically, when leaders say things like that, it's usually when they're not winning. So now the question becomes, why escalate? Why threaten expansion? Why risk a regional war becoming a global one, especially when every expert agrees a ground invasion of Iran would be a nightmare? Look at the map. Iran isn't Iraq. It isn't Afghanistan. It's a fortress, mountains, deserts, narrow choke points. The Zagros Mountains alone create a natural defense system perfect for guerrilla warfare. You can't just roll tanks through that. You get stuck, you get surrounded, you get bled out slowly. From the West Mountains, from the East Desert, from the South distance and terrain, there is no easy entry, no clean victory, no quick exit. And yet there are growing signals that escalation is not only possible, but imminent. Troop deployments are rising, reserves are being prepared, and then there are the unofficial signals, the ones insiders watch: pizza orders near military headquarters spiking, social patterns around defense hubs changing, massive bets placed predicting escalation. Not rumors, patterns. And when patterns align, something is coming. So now we face a paradox. If invading Iran is such a bad idea, why does it look like it's about to happen? Is it incompetence? Is it arrogance? Or is it something much darker? Let me introduce you to a dangerous idea. What if the goal is not to win the war? What if the goal is to lose it? Because if you assume rational strategy, everything suddenly starts to make sense. Let's play this out. If the United States centers a prolonged, unwinnable conflict, what happens? First, it drains resources. Second, it destabilizes global markets. Third, it fractures alliances. And fourth, it accelerates the collapse of the current global system. Now, normally, that would be seen as catastrophic. But what if that collapse is exactly the point? For decades, the world has operated under one system: globalization, one interconnected economy, one financial structure, one dominant reserve currency, one central power. But that system has a weakness. It only works if everyone believes in it. The moment trust breaks, the entire structure begins to fall apart. Trade slows, currencies destabilize, alliances weaken. And suddenly, the global system doesn't collapse overnight. It fractures into regions, into blocs, into survival zones. Now here's where things get interesting. Because while the world is focused on war in the Middle East, there's another strategy quietly unfolding. A strategy centered not on global dominance, but regional control. North America, think about it. Canada, Mexico, Greenland, the Caribbean: energy, food, water, manufacturing, everything needed for self-sufficiency. What if the real goal is to build a fortress economy? A system that doesn't depend on the rest of the world. A system that can survive even if the global order collapses. Now suddenly, everything that looked chaotic starts to look coordinated. Tensions with allies, not mistakes, but repositioning. Trade conflicts, not accidents, but restructuring. Military escalation, not desperation, but acceleration. Because if you believe the global system is going to collapse anyway, you have two choices: wait or control how it happens. And controlling the collapse means triggering it on your terms. Let that sink in, because this isn't just about war. It's about the possibility that millions of people, economic systems, entire nations are being repositioned for a future where the old world no longer exists. Now imagine this: the global economy collapses, trade routes break down, energy supply becomes unstable, food shortages begin, And in that chaos, only a few regions remained stable regions that planned ahead, secured resources, and became self-sufficient in that world. Who wins? Not the most connected, not the most globalized, but the most prepared. So now we come back to the central question. Why would a country risk everything? Why escalate conflict? Why provoke instability? Why challenge allies? Because maybe they're not trying to preserve the current system. Maybe they're preparing for the next one. And the fastest way to build a new world is to break the old one. Now, is this theory true? We don't know. But what we do know is that the world is changing faster than ever. Conflicts are escalating, alliances are shifting, economic signals are flashing warning signs, and the decisions being made today will shape the next century. So the real question isn't, is this happening? The real question is, if it is, are you ready for what comes next? And that's what makes this so dangerous, because we're operating in a world where chaos could be real or engineered or a mix of both. And for you watching this right now, the implications are massive. Because if the global system changes, your life changes, prices, jobs, opportunities, stability, all tied to systems most people never think about. So maybe the question isn't, is this theory correct? Maybe the better question is, what if it is? Because in times of uncertainty, the people who adapt early are the ones who survive best. History doesn't reward the people who ignore change. It rewards the people who recognize it before it becomes obvious. And right now, we might be living through one of the biggest shifts in modern history. Not a headline, not a moment, but a transition. And if this is true, then the next question becomes even more important. Who else knows? And what are they doing to prepare? But there's one more layer to this, and it might be the most important one. Because if this really is a controlled shift, if this really is a transition away from the global system, then the United States isn't acting alone. Think about it. Every major power can see the same signals: rising instability, economic pressure, shifting. Alliances. No one is blind to this, which means other nations are preparing too. This isn't just about one country trying to survive collapse. This is about multiple powers racing to position themselves for what comes after. On one side, you have Western alliances beginning to fracture. On the other, you see new partnerships forming, energy deals outside traditional systems, trade agreements bypassing old currencies, military cooperation increasing in unexpected regions. It's not loud, it's not always on the news, but it's happening, a slow shift away from a single global order into competing spheres of influence. And this is where things get dangerous, because transitions like this rarely happen peacefully. When power structures change, conflict follows, not always immediately, but eventually. Because when multiple powers are trying to secure their future at the same time, their interests collide. And when interests collide, tension becomes confrontation. So now, what we're seeing today might not be random escalation. It might be early positioning, testing boundaries, measuring responses, probing weaknesses, and not all of it is military. Some of it is psychological, narratives, media framing, public perception, because controlling what people believe is just as important as controlling territory. Right now, millions of people are trying to figure out what's happening. Some think it's incompetence, some think it's corruption, some think it's conspiracy, and that confusion, that uncertainty, creates noise. And in that noise, real strategy becomes harder to detect. Because if you wanted to execute a massive geopolitical shift, you wouldn't make it obvious. You'd bury it under chaos, contradictions, mixed signals, unexpected decisions, so that even if someone noticed patterns, they couldn't prove intent. So again, we come back to the same unsettling question. What if what looks like disorder is actually design? Now let's bring this back to you, because it's easy to talk about nations and systems, but at the end of the day, this affects individuals, families, careers, daily life. If global trade slows, prices don't just rise temporarily, they restructure permanently. If alliances weaken, stability doesn't just dip, it becomes unpredictable. And that's the key idea. This might not be a temporary crisis. It might be the beginning of a new normal. And in a new normal, the rules change. What worked before might not work anymore. Dependence on global supply chains becomes risky. Reliance on stable currencies becomes uncertain. Assumptions of peace become less guaranteed. So the real challenge isn't just understanding what's happening. It's adjusting your mindset to a world that might operate very differently. And this isn't about fear, it's about awareness, because panic doesn't help anyone. But being informed, being prepared, that changes everything. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. By the time a shift like this becomes obvious, the biggest opportunities are already gone. Early recognition creates advantage. Late realization creates reaction. So zoom out one last time. A potential unwinnable war, escalating global tensions, shifting alliances, resource competition, economic pressure. Individually, they look like separate events. But together, they might be part of something much bigger. A transition from a globalized world to a fragmented one, from interdependence to regional. Survival, from stability to strategic uncertainty. And if that's true, then the question isn't just about governments anymore. It's about you, where you are, what you depend on, how you adapt. Because history doesn't announce itself when it changes. It shifts quietly at first, then all at once. And right now, we might be standing at the edge of that shift, watching it happen without even realizing how big it really is. So stay aware, stay sharp, because if the world really is changing this fast, then the people who understand it first won't just survive it. They'll define what comes next. But there's still one question left that nobody has fully answered. Even if all of this is just chaos, even if there is no hidden plan, even if everything is just reaction and miscalculation, then why does it feel so coordinated? Why does every crisis seem to feed into the next one? Why does stability never return, only transformation? One explanation is that no one is in control. Instead, the system itself has momentum. Think of it like a massive machine built over decades. Trade, military alliances, financial markets, political systems, all interconnected. And when something this large starts moving in one direction, it becomes extremely difficult to stop. At some point, leaders are no longer designing outcomes. They are simply responding to forces already in motion. Inflation forces reaction, conflict forces alignment, instability forces escalation. Not because someone planned it, but because not responding would be worse. And this is where things become dangerous. Because modern geopolitics runs on feedback loops. A decision in one region affects prices globally. Those prices trigger political pressure. That pressure forces another decision, which creates another shock, and the cycle repeats, faster, tighter, more unstable. This is what analysts sometimes call the acceleration phase of history. Not a conspiracy, not a master plan, but a system reaching the limits of its structure. This is why so many people start to believe there is a hidden script. Because when systems become tightly interconnected, random events don't feel random anymore. They feel like scenes in a storyline, but that is a perception effect, not necessarily a coordinated design. Even military rhetoric, which sounds absolute in the moment, often functions as signaling, strength signaling, deterrence signaling, alliance signaling. What is said publicly is not always what is intended privately, and what is intended privately is not always achievable in reality. This is where the all-powerful strategy idea breaks down, because even the most powerful nations face constraints: logistics, economics, domestic politics, alliance pressure, geography. No single actor can fully control outcomes in a system this complex. So instead of a clean master plan, what we likely have is something far more unstable, competing strategies colliding in real time, each side adjusting, each side reacting, each side trying to avoid worst-case scenarios while accidentally creating new ones. And in that environment, small miscalculations matter more than grand strategies. A delayed response, a misread signal, a political pressure spike, a market shock. Any one of these can cascade, because once systems are tightly linked, failure doesn't stay local. It spreads financially, politically, militarily, psychologically. And this is the real concern many analysts quietly agree on. Not that someone is controlling everything, but that no one can fully control it anymore. History has seen this before, not as a single plan, but as periods of transition where old systems weaken. New systems haven't stabilized, and the gap between them creates volatility. Some historians call this an interregnum period, a time between orders where power is still present but not fully stable. If that framing is correct, then what we are seeing globally is not the execution of one grand strategy, but the stress signals of an old system being replaced. So maybe the truth is less cinematic, but more unsettling. Not a hidden mastermind, not a single controlling blueprint, but millions of decisions, all pushing a complex system toward transformation. And that leaves us with the final question. If the world is not being controlled, but is instead transitioning on its own momentum, then what matters most is not who is in control, but how prepared anyone is for what comes next. Because whether this is design or drift, the outcome is the same. The world we grew up understanding is not the world that is forming now. But there is one more layer to this entire discussion, one that sits underneath all the headlines, underneath all the speeches, and even underneath the strategy debates themselves. And that is this: modern power is no longer just about control, it is about adaptation speed. In past centuries, empires had time to react, time to stabilize borders, time to recover from shocks. But today, time has collapsed. A financial shock in one country spreads globally in seconds. A military escalation is broadcast instantly worldwide. A political statement can shift markets within minutes. Everything is faster. Everything is tighter. Everything is more sensitive. And when a system becomes this interconnected, it starts behaving differently. Not like a machine with clear commands, but like a living network reacting to stress. Small inputs produce large outputs. Minor decisions create global consequences. A single shipping disruption doesn't just affect one port anymore. It affects fuel prices, which affects transportation, which affects food costs, which affects political pressure, which affects elections, which then feeds back into global policy decisions. This is why modern geopolitics feels unstable, because nothing exists in isolation anymore. Every system is linked, every decision echoes. Every escalation has downstream effects no one fully controls. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Human decision-making was never designed for systems this complex. Leaders, institutions, and governments all operate under incomplete information. They react to fragments, they interpret signals, they estimate outcomes, but they never see the full system. So even the most powerful actors are essentially navigating in partial darkness. They can see immediate pressures, they can model probable outcomes, but they cannot predict the full cascade of reactions. And that is where history often shifts, not through intention, but through unintended consequences. A policy designed for stability creates instability. A deterrent strategy triggers escalation. An economic protection measure disrupts supply chains, not because it was planned, but because systems adapt in unpredictable ways. This is also why so many people online start to believe there is a hidden script behind global events. Because from the outside, the sequence looks too structured. Crisis follows crisis. Tension follows tension. Every event feels like it builds toward the next. But what they are actually seeing is pattern recognition in a high-speed system, not coordination, compression. When events happen quickly enough, the brain connects them. It creates narrative. It creates meaning. It creates causality where there may only be correlation. And that is how complexity becomes storytelling. So when people ask, is there a plan behind all of this? The more accurate answer might be, there are many plans, but none of them are fully in control of the outcome. Instead of one global strategist, what exists is a crowded field of actors: states, alliances, corporations, financial institutions, military planners, political leaders, all moving simultaneously. All reacting, all adapting, and from that interaction emerges a result that no single actor intended. This is what complexity scientists call emergent behavior. The outcome is produced by the system, not designed by any one participant. And this matters because it changes how we interpret global instability, instead of asking who is controlling this. A more accurate question might be what system conditions are producing this behavior. Because regardless of intent, the consequences are real. Economies still fluctuate, conflicts still escalate, markets still react, people still feel the impact. So whether the world is moving toward fragmentation, adaptation, or transformation, the experience from the inside remains the same. Uncertainty increases, stability becomes fragile, and change accelerates. And in times like these, the most important advantage is not predicting the future perfectly, but understanding that the system itself is no longer slow, predictable, or linear. It is fast, it is interconnected, and it is constantly evolving. And if we push this even further, beyond the surface-level interpretation of events, we start to see something deeper forming underneath everything else. Because whether people realize it or not, modern civilization is no longer operating like a collection of separate nations making independent decisions. It is operating more like a tightly interconnected system of dependencies, where every major action produces reactions that ripple outward in ways that cannot be fully contained or predicted. A single policy shift in one region doesn't stay local anymore. It immediately interacts with energy markets, which then interact with inflation systems, which then interact with political stability, which then feeds back into leadership decisions under pressure, which then creates new policy shifts that were never originally intended. And once this loop begins to accelerate, it becomes self-reinforcing, not because anyone designed it that way, but because complexity itself creates momentum, the more interconnected a system becomes, the more sensitive it becomes to disruption, and the more those disruptions begin to resemble patterns rather than isolated events. This is why people increasingly feel like everything is connected, even when official narratives insist that each crisis is separate, unrelated, and temporary from within the system. It feels like randomness, but from a distance, it begins to resemble something else entirely. A structure under stress, continuously adjusting but never fully stabilizing, always reacting but never truly resetting. And in that environment, the distinction between intentional strategy and systemic reaction begins to blur in a way that is extremely difficult for the human mind to separate cleanly, because we are not built to process this level of global interdependence in real time. And this is where the concept of control itself starts to break down under scrutiny, because in older historical systems, control was relatively linear. A ruler, an empire, or a centralized authority could issue decisions and expect relatively predictable outcomes within their domain. The world was slower, communication was delayed, and the number of variables was limited enough that outcomes could be shaped with a reasonable degree of certainty. But in the modern era, that structure no longer exists in the same form. Instead, what we have is a distributed network of decision-makers operating simultaneously across economic, military, technological, and political domains, all reacting to incomplete information while attempting to anticipate the reactions of others who are doing exactly the same thing. This creates a layered feedback environment where every decision is both a response and a trigger at the same time. And in such a system, even the most powerful actors cannot fully predict the long-term consequences of their own actions, because those consequences depend not only on their decisions, but on the reactions of every other interconnected node in the system. This is why outcomes often appear inconsistent or contradictory when viewed moment by moment, yet strangely coherent when viewed over longer time frames. It is not that a hidden controller is guiding events from behind the scenes, but rather that the structure of the system itself forces certain types of outcomes to emerge under stress. And when enough stress accumulates across enough interconnected points, the system begins to behave in ways that resemble coordination, even when what is actually happening is mutual reaction under pressure. And as this pressure continues to build, another layer emerges that complicates the picture even further: perception. Because human beings do not experience global systems directly, we experience fragments of them: headlines, data points, short-term economic changes, political statements, isolated conflicts, and our brains, naturally wired to find meaning and patterns, begin to assemble these fragments into narratives that feel coherent and directional, even when the underlying reality is far more chaotic and multi-causal. This is where the illusion of intentional design becomes especially powerful. When events happen slowly and separately, randomness is easy to accept. But when events happen rapidly, in overlapping sequences, the brain begins to connect them into storylines. One crisis appears to lead into another. One escalation appears to justify the next. One decision appears to explain the previous reaction. And over time, this creates the impression that there must be an overarching structure guiding it all. But what we are actually seeing is the compression of complexity into narrative form. A high-speed system produces outputs too fast for human cognition to analyze individually, so the mind aggregates them into simplified explanations. This is not a flaw in reasoning, it is a survival adaptation. But in the modern information environment, where global systems move faster than perception can comfortably track, this adaptation can produce distorted interpretations of reality. And this is precisely where competing narratives emerge. Some interpret the system as coordinated strategy, others interpret it as pure chaos, and others still see it as manipulation. Yet all of these interpretations are attempting to explain the same underlying phenomenon: a world operating at a level of complexity that exceeds any single observer's ability to fully map in real time. And ultimately, this brings us to the final layer of understanding, which is that the question may no longer be about whether there is a plan, or whether there is chaos, or whether there is coordination behind global events. The more accurate framing might be that we are observing a transition in how systems behave when they exceed certain thresholds of size, speed, and interconnection. Because once a system becomes large enough, fast enough, and interdependent enough, it begins to exhibit properties that are no longer reducible to individual intent. It starts to behave like an ecosystem rather than a machine, where stability is temporary, adaptation is constant, and equilibrium is always shifting rather than fixed. In such a state, what we call control becomes less about directing outcomes and more about managing constraints under uncertainty. Every actor within the system is forced to operate within limits imposed not just by other actors, but by the structure of the system itself. And as those constraints tighten, the range of possible outcomes narrows, even as the number of interactions increases. This creates a paradox where the system becomes both more complex and more predictable in certain directions, yet simultaneously more unstable in its specific details. And this is why the present moment feels so significant. Even if no single event appears decisive on its own, it is not one action that defines the transition, but the accumulation of thousands of interlinked pressures converging at the same time, whether this leads to fragmentation, reorganization, or stabilization in a new form, is not something that can be determined from within the system. At any single point in time, it is something that only becomes clear in hindsight, when the pattern has already fully formed. Until then, all participants, individuals, institutions, and nations alike, are simply moving through the transition as it unfolds, interpreting signals, responding to pressures, and adapting to a reality that is still actively becoming itself.